Thank you very much, and it's a real treat to be with you all. I've interacted with the Korean Navy far too little in my life, but every single time I have really enjoyed it. I've been impressed not only with the quality of your ships and hardware, but also the superb quality of your people, which are the most important thing in the final analysis. So I congratulate you midshipmen on the career that you're embarking upon in the coming months and years. So I want to talk to you about China this evening. It's obviously something near and dear to your own hearts, just because this is your life that I'm going to talk about, and I hope that I will help you give you some tools to think about the Chinese challenge and how the United States, Korea, and our other allies in East Asia can help manage this challenge. Now, I open with this slide. This is, showing that this is not the Chinese Navy. The Chinese Navy is not made up of junks. It's not made up of old small coastal patrol boats with 20-millimeter guns, all that kind of stuff. But I open with this picture because I think this is the impression that was formed in American minds during the Cold War, during the ages in which the PLA Navy was a Maoist People's War at Sea coastal defense force. And I think these impressions lingered long past the time when China actually set out to build a serious navy. And I think that set us back in the United States as far as coming to terms with this challenge and getting ready to handle this challenge in what our senior leadership is calling an era of great power competition, great power strategic competition. So I think it's worth bearing this in mind. Now, for a long period of time, this actually, let's see if I can get the slide to advance here. There we go. I had to click on the screen. Yeah, this impression lingered into the 1990s. These are nice looking vessels here, but at the same time, these are coastal defense, brown water types of vessels, basically built to erect a buffer off China's coastlines to keep a great power navy away from its coastlines. A very limited force built on things like patrol boats, small patrol boats, diesel submarines, coastal frigates, and whatnot. So again, reality did very little to debunk these assumptions in American minds on into the 1990s, when, as we know, China set out to build the navy that we see taking shape in front of our eyes. We typically date the Chinese maritime buildup to the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995 and 1996, in which the Chinese Communist leadership felt really embarrassed that the United States could send two carrier battle groups to China's backyard to deter misbehavior on China's part, and that Beijing, the PLA, could not only not target these aircraft carrier strike groups, but not even find them. They resolved, never again is this going to happen. And I think that based on that resolve, we've seen a constant upward trajectory in China's efforts to acquire shipping, build shipping, and develop all the accoutrements of a great navy. It's been a really impressive thing. China is a really impressive competitor. And I think finally in recent years we have started coming to terms with this, which brings me to the beginning. I wanted to talk to you about China, what I call China's contested zone. And guess what? Korea is squarely in the middle of that contested zone. So as I go along, try to look at what I am saying through the lenses of your own experience as people who reside in Northeast Asia, and try to maintain order and prosperity and security in the waters of Northeast Asia once you put those uniforms on in a few months. So that's where I will start off. As I said, China has become a very impressive competitor. For example, we are starting to see photos sometimes provided by the PLA itself, such as this one, showing that the PLA has put rather impressive platforms to sea. This of course is one of China's very first working ballistic missile submarines, nuclear powered ballistic missile submarines. Interestingly, as you all probably know, China went through a really painful time in the 1950s through the 1970s because of Mao. It was because anybody with scientific and technical expertise looked like a challenge to Mao. It was really dangerous to be such a person, and they were either suppressed or worse. With the result that China was very slow to master things like naval nuclear propulsion, which of course is a key to putting to sea a working second strike capability that is the heart of nuclear deterrence. And yet, right before our eyes, we were starting to see them get past these challenges. But again, sort of a historical accident that had unwanted and unforeseen repercussions for China's foreign policy and its military and naval strategy. And you get the idea. They are starting to work on nuclear powered attack submarines, They're starting to put to sea surface vessels that look very familiar. This looks like a knockoff of one of our Arleigh Burke class destroyers in the United States, and also it looks very much like one of your own Aegis ships or Japanese Aegis ships. So we are starting to see what looks like a modern blue water fleet take to the seas as we watch. China has fielded large numbers of frigates, which obviously are very critical to policing the seas against lower end threats. If you want to face down the Philippines or Vietnam in the South China Sea, these look like adequate platforms. You can build them in large numbers. You can deploy them. They're not so aggressive looking, and therefore, if they still outmuscle the regional competitors, this is a platform of choice for China. And you get the sense, again, this is a modern blue water fleet taking shape before our eyes. And of course, the thing that one of the platforms that's really occasioned a lot of buzz here in the United States and in the region itself, China's pursuit of naval aviation, carrier aviation capabilities. Here we see the Liaoning, of course, a remanufactured Soviet era flat top bought by China and refitted and put to sea as a training carrier. China, I believe, is now on its third aircraft carrier. So again, we're watching fast progress in that area. But it's one interesting thing to me is that China, even as it starts looking like a modern sort of a Western fleet or a modern fleet, it has stayed true to that Maoist tradition of coastal defense. It has continued building these smaller platforms in order to make things tough on a great power navy such as ourselves, such as yours, or such as Japan's. China has built large numbers of these Hobei Type 22 catamarans, each armed with 8 anti-ship missiles and suitable for basically lurking offshore in the contested zone to make things tough on a hostile fleet, closing in on the first island chain or on Chinese shores. So again, this coastal defense tradition remains a vibrant thing in China's fleet design and maritime strategy. Which leads me sort of to this before we stop the showing pictures here and start talking about strategy and things. Isn't this a metaphor for where China's Navy has been and where it is now and where it might be going in the future? With this small primitive looking frigate passing in front of a nice shiny looking frigate or destroyer sitting in a Chinese seaport. So again, it's been fascinating to watch how fast China has gotten this done. A competitor, a nation that wants to go to sea and has enough resources and determination to do it, can do it in relatively short order. I guess China's been at it for about 25 years. That's a pretty impressive progress from basically square one to having the largest fleet in the world and also rivaling in qualitative terms the other regional navies. So again, that's something that you all will be living with every day. Song Hoon mentioned my books here. I'll show you. Please don't buy them if you have. Actually, I don't know if you all have access to our Chief of Naval Operations professional reading program, but you should. You can get a freebie copy. You can get a freebie copy via ebook of this book, and also he mentioned the brief guide to maritime strategy, which I briefed to this group last year when the cruise training group was in the South China Sea. This book in particular is written for you. I wrote it for midshipmen and for newly commissioned officers who have no time to read about strategy or learn about this stuff, but yet might find a couple of hours to get through a short book about it. So I try to distill the essence of the classics of maritime strategy into a short book in hopes that people like you will actually position yourselves well so that you don't go to the War College or wherever at mid-career and not know anything about Mahan or Corbett or the other greats of maritime strategy. So I would commend that one to you as well, and you should be able to get a free copy of that as well. And hopefully the translation, Song Hoon mentioned that a while ago. Okay, let's turn to the substance of the talk for the evening. This is a passage out of an article, it's an old article at this point, by Barry Posen up at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is about 75 miles that away. He wrote an article for the journal International Security about China's contested zone. And he makes a point that should be intuitively obvious to us as military people. There is a home team advantage. Even a weaker combatant has a home team advantage that it can deploy against a stronger competitor, and perhaps either hold off that competitor or perhaps even defeat that competitor. Why is that? Because if I'm operating close to home, I'm close to my bases. I have all my resources. I have the people on my side. there's just an array of advantages that go even to a weaker contender. Posen in this case is actually talking about Afghanistan, in which case we saw a much, much weaker contender obviously do us harm and ultimately outlast us, as we saw very painfully last August rather, with the pullout from Afghanistan. So again, if a weaker adversary can use these advantages to do a stronger competitor great damage, and perhaps even induce that competitor to quit and go away and leave them as the victors. So, and it's something you see from time to time in history. In fact, scholars, I don't do this myself, but historians have actually looked back at the histories, and they estimate that the weaker power wins about 30% of the time in military history, which is actually saying something. When if you weigh a much stronger contender against a much weaker one, you would think that the stronger are almost always going to weak, but it's just not that. That's just not the case for a variety of reasons. So, having set the stage, let me turn to an instance in which China, an increasingly robust contender, can try to mount such a contested zone against what it considers the stronger competitor, namely the United States and the United States allies in East Asia. Let's look at what a contested zone is for China. So I will slice and dice the talk this evening by four, and we'll look at it along four axes. Theory, we'll talk about what the common is, the maritime common is. Geography, the first island chain, of which Korea is, I would say, an integral part. It's sort of a half island grafted onto the continent of Asia, but I would argue that it's also part of the first island chain in a very real sense, even though it's not an island. Strategy. We will look at what China means when it talks about active defense, a very Maoist concept that it has given new life and taken out to sea during the recent 2 to 3 decades. And lastly, we'll look at how China is trying to take all these factors, translate theory, geography, and strategy into a working maritime strategy that could help China get its way in the competition with the United States, whether it's in the Taiwan Strait, whether it's off the Senkaku Islands in the South China Sea, or whatever the hot spot might happen to be at that time. Okay, we'll start right off with theory. This gentleman to the lower right-hand side is Alfred Thayer Mahan, who you may or may not heard of. He was our second president here at the Naval War College twice, once in the 1880s, once in the 1890s. He was the very first strategy professor. He's my most distant ancestor on the War College faculty. And I would say he's the most influential maritime historian and theorist in history. When he starts writing about maritime strategy, he starts in very basic terms. He asks what the sea is, and he describes it as what he calls a wide common. A common being basically a space, geographic space that belongs to everybody and belongs to nobody. That is what the sea is, and this is the basic idea encoded in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. There was for many centuries, especially in Europe, there was an argument about whether coastal states could own the seas that adjoined their shores. You had the Dutch and the other Friends of Freedom of the Sea arguing no. At the time, England and some of the other seafaring states said yes. England claimed that it was sovereign over the waters of northwestern Europe. So this legal argument played out over many centuries, and finally, we seem to have come down on the position that no one owns the sea, with very limited exceptions set forth by treaty, by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So Mahan obviously has a very important part in that, in defining the common and stating what it is. People can go in all directions through the common for commercial purposes or for military purposes. Mahan thought that the basic purpose of sea power was commerce, the ability to gain access to foreign lands where you would like to trade so that you can make yourselves wealthy and prosperous, which all nations want to do. And also, by the way, generate the revenue to pay for a navy to protect that trade. So he's very much about commercially driven sea power. That being the case, he maintains that communications in this case, not being picking up your cell phone or whatever, but the ability to use the sea lanes for commercial or military purposes is the most critical ingredient in strategy, whether it's political strategy or military strategy, or obviously naval strategy as well. And therefore, if I can control communications, if I can control the ability of navies and merchant fleets to use the sea, that is something that's going to strike at the very roots of a nation's vigor. He compares it. It's for him. It's like cutting the roots of a plant. If I can use the sea, then I can trade. I can make sure that I have all those nutrients come in that are represented by trade, by revenue that you get from it. But if your adversary cannot use the sea because you are blocking your adversary off the sea, at that point, it's like cutting the roots of a plant. The plant shrivels and dies, and that's a big part of maritime strategy. You can bring the economic hurt against your adversaries in times of war. So this gives us a baseline to start looking at maritime Asia. And by the way, this is the passage out of Mahan's most famous book, which I have pictured to the left here, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which was made out of his lectures here at the War College and put into print in 1890. Here's how he defines command of the sea. He defines it in really absolute terms. He describes it as overbearing power upon the sea that drives off an enemy's flag, or at most allows that flag to appear as a fugitive. And therefore, if I have maritime command, if I have more or less permanent command of the waters that I deem vital, I can control that common, and I can control what happens there, including commerce moving across the waves. So again, he sees this as basically certainly the operational goal of maritime strategy is to command the sea, drive off your enemy's flag, blockade your adversary's fleet and port, and then at that point, exert control of the sea lanes. You do that, and you put yourself in very good stead to win the war, whatever kind of war it might be. Oh, and I summed out the key passages here. Again, overbearing power, man. You're really talking about spending all day every day at Gold's Gym and bulking up and making yourself really, really strong. So again, he has a very extreme version of what sea control is. It gives you that control that allows you not only to drive off the enemy's battle fleet, but also to control commerce, and thus, again, cause economic pain to your adversary. When I started, when I and my cohort Toshi Yoshihara, we used to write together quite a bit. When we started studying China's Navy back in late 2003, and especially in 2004. We started looking at some of the Chinese writings, and this passage, the Command of the Sea, this was the very first passage that started cropping up over and over and over in Chinese strategic commentaries. I mean, think about that. What that suggests about the nature of Chinese sea power, about the attitudes driving Chinese sea power. If the only thing you know about maritime strategy is that it's about overbearing power upon the sea, in which you destroy or blockade your adversary's fleet. That's going to give you a pretty hard-edged view of what sea power is and how to use it. So I think that's something for us to ponder as we look at how China uses this big shiny new fleet that it is constructing. If that's your sort of your North Star, if that's your guidance, you're gonna tend to take a very sort of an ominous view of what is happening at sea and how you should respond to it. The one thing, and I don't think this will be any secret to you who are very familiar with China, but in the United States, I think this is one thing I always stress to my students and other audiences here in the U.S. These are people who really do their homework. They are strategically minded. They are historically minded. They sort of vacuum up all sorts of writings about history and theory and strategy, including Toshi's in my very first book. Which appeared back on China and Mahan's influence in China, which is substantial. They actually did a bootleg translation to circulate in the PLA Navy and the PLA leadership. So they put it out a Chinese version, and they put on a foreword that said, "Here is what these guys are saying about us." So China is looking at us, looking at them. And I think that's a very impressive thing that they've done. These are serious competitors. Don't think I have to tell you that, but I usually do sort of kick the table when I'm talking to non-specialists on this side of the Pacific. Okay, let's turn more specifically to the present day common. We're always talking about the global common now. Well, we tend to, I mean, Mahan's talking about the surface of the sea. Submarines are only becoming a thing in his lifetime. They don't really come to maturity. Military aviation exists by the time he dies in 1914, but again, it doesn't really come to fruition until well after his death. So he's talking about the surface of the sea. Today we expand how we understand the global common. We think of it as much more a 3D thing. It's not only the surface of the sea, it's also the subsurface domain where submarines operate. It's also outer space, which obviously unfolds the entire globe. And oftentimes we usually tend to expand it to include cyberspace And the Pentagon, the U.S. military, has recently taken to including the electromagnetic spectrum in that as well. So they are seeing it not only as a physical domain, but it's also, in the case of cyberspace and the electromagnetic spectrum. These are sort of domains that exist everywhere and nowhere. I mean, I'm not exactly sure where cyberspace is, other than it's all around us, but it's also kind of hard to locate unless you could find servers or whatnot. So I think the way we look at the common today is a little bit more diffuse than it was in the days of Mahan. But I think this is really what shapes the challenges before us. Scholars, I mean, people who study strategy, and especially who studied American strategy after the Cold War, when the major threat, the Soviet Navy, had gone away, they point out that the United States was able to make itself number one in the world in that interlude after the Cold War by commanding the commons. This is a source of American primacy. We can use the common to get where we need to go in order to shape events, whether it's diplomatically, whether it's economically, and especially militarily. If we can project power into the rimlands of East Asia and Western Europe, and I would say today South Asia, this is how the United States helps preserve the international system as we've known it since the end of World War II. If I want to do that, what are my goals? Well, my operational goals, I mean, those are sort of the big strategic goals. What are my operational goals? And they're pretty straightforward. I need to make sure that I can use the common. If I cannot get to the rimlands of Eurasia, then I can't do much there. And therefore, I need to maximize my ability to use the common. Much as Mahan talked about cutting the roots of a plant, I need the ability to deny access to my adversary so that I can enjoy all the blessings that Mahan pointed out when he was writing about the maritime common over a century ago. And lastly, sort of as a process of interaction, if my adversary is able to hobble my access, I need the ability to basically push him back so that I can restore my freedom of movement and therefore my access to places I need to go for whatever purposes my leadership back home deems fit. So pretty straightforward. And I think this is a concept. This is a way of thinking about strategy that really shapes how we do things pretty much day in and day out these days. You don't often hear it couched quite in such simple terms, but I really think this is what it's all about. Now, I mean, Mahan had a lot of influence, as I told you. You don't hear him quoted all that much around the United States, even in the professional military community, all that much these days. But I think part of that is because he's so ingrained in our assumptions that you don't need to quote him in order to come up with ideas and in this case strategic documents that express Mahanian ideas. If you look at any of these guiding documents reaching all the way back to 2007, you can find some really Mahanian passages in there. Reaching all the way back to the 2007 Maritime Strategy, our very first post-Cold War true maritime strategy, reaching up to our most recent 2020 Maritime Strategy, in which I had a part in framing last year, and just down the list. All these documents have language about commanding the commons, even if it's not expressed precisely in those terms. The United States Marine Corps, by the way, under Commandant David Berger, over the last two and a half years or thereabouts, has been a very Mahanian service. The family of concepts that the Marines are looking at in order to deter an adversary, deter China, or perhaps defeat China if necessary in your backyard. These are all very Mahanian seeming documents. They're all about denying China access, guaranteeing U.S. access, and thus our ability to keep our commitments to our allies. And you'll just see these concepts just again and again in the documents coming out of the United States Marine Corps. This is what we call naval integration. We're trying to reforge the Marine Corps and our Navy, the United States Navy, into a single fighting implement, rather than doing what we've been doing for the last few decades, which is treating basically the Marine Corps as something that you take to a beach and put on shore in order to project power ashore. We're trying to reform the tradition of combined naval operations between these sister services. So that's just a bit of an aside of some of the things that are going on here in the United States. As I said, there's a lot of this language. I'm not going to go through it in any depth, but I mean, reaching all the way back to 2010 with our quadrennial defense review. Every 4 years, we sort of take a basic relook at our maritime interests and our military interests and see how we're doing and what we need to do differently. But again, here's that Mahanian sort of language. Let me summon it out. The rise of rival powers endangers our access to and our ability to use the commons. This is a bad thing because if you go down to that second passage, security and prosperity depend on the free flow of goods as well as military power through this commons. By the way, an adversary is increasingly able to challenge our access and thus threaten the international system as a whole. This is the connective tissue of the international system. It is what binds the whole thing together. If an adversary can loosen that up, at that point the system is in grave danger, and that's something that it behooves us not to let happen. I said I would mention, or I said I would quote briefly from the 2007 Maritime Strategy. Again, our very first true maritime strategy after the Cold War. And it's all about cooperation, about alliances and partnerships to preserve freedom of the sea, police the sea in peacetime, do all things that help us become prosperous through seaborne trade in peacetime. And yet, even in this cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power, you find a passage like this. I mean, look at this. We will not permit an adversary to inhibit our freedom of maneuver, nor disrupt the global supply chain, something we've been talking about a lot lately, by attempting to block off the sea lines of communications. And it goes on, and this is how it concludes. We will be able to impose local sea control wherever we deem necessary, preferably with allies or partners, but by ourselves if necessary. That's a pretty powerful statement. I mean, Mahan himself, I mean, when he talked about command of the sea, he's thinking about the United States as a rising power, which is what it was during his lifetime. He thought we mainly needed to keep adversaries away from our East Coast, away from our West Coast, and we needed to command the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico, which is where the sea lanes for the Panama Canal would run once the canal opened in 1914 and 1915. That's a pretty limited vision when compared to this document, which essentially talks about being able to command any body of water on the face of planet Earth at the discretion of the leadership in Washington, hopefully with allies, but perhaps not. That's why I would call this a hyper-Mahanian maritime statement of maritime strategy. And you've seen this kind of language appear in all documents since then. If anything, the tone has only gotten more fearful and more aggressive in our documents, simply because we see the world changing around us. We see the rise of a serious contender in East Asia, and the need to frame countermeasures to help keep that challenger at bay. This is, this comes from about the same time. And in fact, this article accompanied the appearance of that maritime strategy document. This is Michelle Flournoy. She's now in the think tank sector. We briefly thought she was going to be our Secretary of Defense. Didn't turn out that way. But in any event, she was working in the Pentagon when the QDR came out, and she gave credit to Mahan where credit was due, and giving him credit for forging the concept of the commons. She posted this in the Naval Institute Proceedings, our flagship of professional service or a professional journal here in the United States Navy, and thus kind of gave him a shout out from a century after his death. Here's our most recent Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, a friend, actually a wonderful man, a friend of mine, and he was a very strategically minded CNO. In some of his opening documents when he came to office in 2015, he started talking about the strategist. It was really amazing. Naval officers don't talk about that stuff all that much, except when they're in the schoolhouse here in the United States. And yet here you have the United States top uniformed naval officer talking about Thucydides, Clausewitz, Mahan, Corbett, all the people we find and we used to shape our thinking and thinking of our students when they come to us in Newport and in other institutions like the Naval War College around the world. When you have a very senior person like this actually commending these sources of strategic thought, that's a really powerful thing, because as you all well know, if I wear gold on my sleeves or stars on my collar, that's something that's going to be a tone setter for the service, because everybody junior to that person is going to take that very seriously, simply because the top leadership is deeming it important. Mahanian language, and by the way, if you're interested in the thinking within the United States Navy right now, this is the maritime strategy that appeared in the waning weeks of the Trump administration last December 2020, and it's very, very Mahanian in outlook. It's about access denial. It's about defeating Chinese access denial and waging a form of access denial of our own and of our allies' own in order to basically box the PLA Navy and Air Force within the China Seas, to deny them access to the Western Pacific. It's not put that bluntly, but if you read between the lines, that's really what it's all about. So again, Mahan has a long shadow, and not only but not only in his native country, also in China as well, as I alluded to right at the outset. I think I probably half of my writings in my entire career have been about Mahan's influence in China, which again is serious and substantial. They will tell you this. Back before things got so bad between ourselves and China, we would oftentimes have a PLA Navy delegation come to Newport, and we would meet in the Mahan reading room where the big portrait of Mahan hangs, without fail. Every single time the leader of the Chinese delegation would point at it, when he was opening his remarks, he would point to that and he would say, "This guy is very important to us. We study him our entire careers." So again, that's a pretty strong statement on behalf of not only of the value of strategic thought in China, but also of Mahan's influence more specifically. You can see it exuded through China's defense white papers. It's biennial statements about how it sees the strategic environment and wants to manage it. This is all the way back in 2004, back long before the PLA Navy and the PLA Air Force were what they are today, but long before China could actually think about commanding the waters and skies offshore. The PLA Navy leadership and the PLA Air Force leadership is already talking about it. We must do what we can to strengthen our capabilities to win command of the sea and command of the air. Again, and you can imagine my reaction when I saw this come out back in 2004. I mean, this is really exciting. I was like, man, here's Mahan right on paper, and here you have an emerging rival who's talking about talking about its strategy and its force design in terms reminiscent of the masters of strategy. Really kind of shocking. So in that case, aspiration definitely led the material preparations and the thinking that goes into maritime strategy. But yet, this is a statement of Chinese ambition. 2006, much the same type of verbiage, except that it talks more about the geographic dimension, the strategic depth for maritime operations. This is something that it vows to expand gradually as technology advances, as more and more platforms are built, and so forth. So it is trying to match ambition with actual material capabilities and human capabilities. 2008, and you get the idea. I mean, you basically see the state council, the ruling state council, on behalf of the People's Liberation Army, talking about further expanding strategic depth for offshore operations. Started talking about things like mounting operations in distant waters. This was the year when they first started counter piracy duty in the Western Indian Ocean. So again, they are describing what they are doing, and they are also stating what they are going to do in the future. So kind of a pretty methodical way of talking about strategy. So again, you almost see Mahan versus Mahan in a sense, between Mahan's influence in the Western powers and then Mahan's influence in China. Interesting to see how each side will interpret those writings, merge them in with their own strategic traditions and so forth, which I will talk about a bit more about as I go along. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the geographic dimension because this dimension is so familiar to you. So I will just sort of blow through this section and we'll get on and talk about strategy and forces. The geographic dimension, I think I usually start with this because American students are pretty familiar with World War II in the Pacific. In fact, in the Navy and the Marine Corps, we talk about it all the time. In a sense, what China is doing today it's somewhat reminiscent of what Imperial Japan tried to do in the 1930s and into the 1940s. Basically cordon off the Western Pacific and the South China Sea, the Southern Resource Area, and make them Japan's own. In a sense, China has something sort of the same thing in mind. It would like that to be its zone of I don't know what you want to call it, its sphere of interest. So basically a sphere of Chinese primacy in which China makes the rules and others obey. The United States is either gone from the region or pays basically defers to Chinese wishes. So again, I think China would like to have its way, perhaps not within quite so extensive a sphere, but certainly reaching out towards the second island chain. This is not a new way of thinking. I mean, this sort of grainy news article from the New York Times in January of 1950 depicts what Secretary of State Dean Acheson, at the outbreak of the Korean War, called America's defense perimeter of the Pacific. Man, think about what he's saying. Let me trace this out for you. Man, if the first island chain is America's defense perimeter of the Pacific, what does that say about the communist bloc, Soviet Union, obviously back in those days, but also China? man, that suggests that the United States is going to box in. It's going to box in the Soviet Navy and the PLA Navy within the first island chain, and thus bar them access to the Western Pacific. So that's something that had to resonate in Beijing and Moscow back in those days. And in fact, I think when you hear the Chinese accuse us in the United States of having a Cold War mentality, I think this is what they're seeing in their minds. They're seeing this geographic containment arc that's shown on the screen here. But again, this is very, very familiar to you all as well. I mean, again, the first island chain, you can think about it as almost as a perimeter in which Western powers, the United States, the blue team I've shown here is pressing inward. China would love to press outward and break through that chain to assure its access to the Western Pacific. So that's the geographic element that is before us. Second island chain obviously exists out there. The major takeaway I would give you there is that Guam, of course, where you are now, lies at the center of the second island chain, and this is something that really focuses China's attentions. I would also just suggest to you that when I talk about the contested zone, rather, I would say it lies somewhere between the first and second island chain. I think China would like to push it as far outward as it can, perhaps even beyond the second island chain, a possibility given some of the impressive weapons they put together in the last decade or so. But again, I think shoreward of the second island chain, I think that is probably what China thinks about as its contested zone, in which it can put ordnance on target to make things difficult on a stronger adversary, and thus prevent our ability to unite forces already in the theater with the U.S. Pacific Fleet and associated joint forces coming from Hawaii or our West Coast in order to mount superior combat power at the time and place of battle. Again, Taiwan Strait, pick your favorite hotspot. Yeah, first island chain again. Yeah, it's here. It's interpreted a little bit. The second island chain, rather, is interpreted a little bit differently for some reason. Don't need to get into that so much tonight. This is actually an interesting map to me, but for a couple of reasons. But one, because it comes in the back of a recent translation of Mahan's book in China, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, if you look what the cartographer is saying, he's basically taking an extreme vision of what the first island chain is, reaching all the way up into the Aleutians. That's not too controversial to me. And it's sort of a standard interpretation, reaching all the way down to the Strait of Malacca. Second island chain, again, sort of reaching down from central Japan on down to New Guinea or thereabouts. This is the interesting part for me, though. Look at that. Look at what this cartographer describes as a third island chain. And there it is right there. What is that? Well, I mean, that's the Hawaiian Islands looping south towards Fiji, south towards Fiji and American Samoa. If I'm sitting in Beijing, gazing eastward out into the Pacific, and I think that something that's only about 2,400 miles from San Francisco on our west coast is part of Asia's third island chain. I think that says something about the mentality that's at work here. They see concentric chains of American military power that are bounding and inhibiting China's maritime aspirations, and that's something that they really don't think they can live with. So if the United States, if it does the Mahanian thing, if the Navy and the Marine Corps and the other services could command the Pacific Ocean, this is something that's really intolerable for China, and it's something that China needs to break through. Yep, you can look at any of the annual Pentagon reports on Chinese military power, and you're going to see a map like this. And again, sort of trying to convey exactly what I've been saying. Every single version is going to have something like that. Which leads me to this. I mean, this is a graphic out of the second edition of the Red Star over the Pacific book, which Sang-Hoon mentioned at the beginning, and which I showed on screen. It just feels like that 1,500 nautical miles figure as far as range from Chinese coastlines. It seems to come up over and over again, not only in discussions of strategy and operations and tactics, but also as far as the ranges of new weaponry that the PLA Navy has built or obtained from foreign suppliers, mostly built these days, as far as anti-ship missiles, as far as missile-armed aircraft, all the different things I showed you at the beginning, as far as missile-armed submarines and small craft. They all seem geared to mounting a contested zone within the roughly that figure. So again, sort of within the second island chain. But I do think they will push that out as far as they can go. Interestingly, I was reading about the War Plan Orange not long ago. Our plan here in the U.S. developed at Newport for fighting the Second World War. The war planners assumed that the fleet, as it went to the rescue of the Philippine Islands after a Japanese attack, would be under attack, or at least under danger of attack, for the last 3,000 miles of its voyage. So so I started off with Imperial Japan. I posited that China has something like that in mind. This is not some sort of outrageous extrapolation I've made here. It has happened before, and I think that's something we have to contend with. This could be a very real problem. And there you go. There you have it. So I would at least put that out there as something for you to think about. And a way to interpret the daily news, as well as your own missions as naval officers as you take up your duties in the coming months and years. Okay, let's talk some strategy. That's what I do all day, every day. I posited to you that Mahan helps supply the rationale, the logic behind a major blue water navy for China, but but Mahan doesn't really tell a modern strategist or tactician much about how to actually use a modern fleet in battle, simply because fleets in his age were changing over from sail to steam, and they were just very different things. As I start to think about how to use the PLA Navy, if I'm a PLA Navy commander, I look to my own indigenous sources of strategic wisdom. Mao Zedong, as you well know, was the founding chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. Fascinating guy, actually. I don't think I would have liked to know him, but I tell you what, he had a pretty powerful mind. He read Clausewitz, he read Sun Tzu, he read all the great classics of strategy, and he synthesized them into what he called active defense. And this is something that the PLA Navy looks to just about every day. Active defense is a strategy of the weaker combatant that is operating on its own turf, on its own home field. It's the idea that I can lure my adversary deep into close to my base areas and basically just wear him out over time with lots of small-scale attacks until I become if I can wear my adversary down, I can ultimately make myself the stronger contender and win. And that's what it's all about in the end. It's about wearing down a stronger adversary while making yourself stronger, and thus flipping the military balance in your favor, going on the conventional counteroffensive and dealing the adversary a convincing defeat. So if you ask Mao and if you ask the PLA leadership today, they will say this is a strategically defensive posture. We are not trying to take anything from anybody, but yet we are going to use highly offensively minded operations and tactics in order to prosecute this strategic defense. Now, we know that China is trying to recover what it regards as rightfully its own after a series of defeats during the century of humiliation. So what China says today is strategically defensive is likely to look very offensive in the eyes of Taiwan, Japan, other East Asian powers. But nonetheless, that's the case that China will make to you. So it's strategic defense through operational and tactical offense, which would sort of be the bumper sticker for how China would describe its strategy. I think this was obviously a land-bound strategy for waging war against Japan on land and against the Chinese nationalists on land. But I actually think it teleports, it transports right out to sea, and especially it fits very well within the first island chain. But I actually think the logic of active defense goes much farther than that. I think it extends throughout that contested zone that I have posited exists today for China. Ultimately, keep in mind, the goal is to win, though. It may be a defensively oriented strategy, but nonetheless, the final goal is to win, is to command in Mahanian terms. Field that overbearing power that drives off my adversaries, and thus leaves the PLA Navy, Air Force, and other services in utter control of the Western Pacific, not only the surface of the sea, but also those other elements of the common that I listed for you a little while ago. So there he is, the man of the hour. I found that picture online about a year ago. You don't often see Mao pictured anything to do with the sea, so I immediately bought this and dumped it right in here. I thought that was kind of a neat graphic. So I've described active defense to you a little bit. I've described it in Maoist terms. But again, as I said, the PLA repeatedly pays tribute to this. So it was kind of a silly debate we had here as recently as about 5 years ago about what China's maritime and military strategy is. Well, it's the same thing it's been since the 1930s when Mao wrote his writings. That was when he formulated the concept of active defense. And here, thankfully, in the most recent defense white paper, which was actually China's only published military strategy statement of its military strategy, here's what they have to say. This is almost right up front in that document, which is available online to you. Here's what they say. The concept of active defense is not only still valid, it is the essence. It is the essence of the Chinese Communist Party's thought about military strategy. So again, they're saying this is the core of what we are all about. And they go on to basically say exactly what I just did. It is about unifying strategic defense and pursuing strategic defense through highly offensive operational and tactical methods. So again, it's defense through offense in that sense. So it's kind of nice for the Chinese to actually confirm what those of us who believed it was all about active defense were actually had it right about that. Okay, let's as I start to wind down towards the end, let's talk about where the rubber meets the road. I mean, how do you translate this into actual working forces that you can actually put out to sea or into the air in order to get your way in strategic competition, or heaven forbid, in warfare? What kind of capabilities does China have in mind here? Well, I've alluded to a lot of these things before. The Pentagon describes this as a layered defense. I mean, it only makes sense. You would put your longest range weapons. You would cut loose with those first, and then as an adversary approaches your shores, you would add additional firepower to that as the hostile force came within reach of each potential weapon system, or each particular weapon system. So as the United States Pacific Fleet, if we come to the rescue of Korea or Japan or whoever our ally who is in trouble in the Pacific, obviously the Pacific Fleet and the affiliated joint forces are going to come in contact with increasingly dense defenses as they start to approach the Asian shorelines. How will the Chinese use these different things? All these shore-based aircraft, all these ballistic missiles and whatnot. Well, they have a doctrine that they call systems destruction warfare, and this is something that you all should study because it's going to bear on how you do things in the ROK Navy in the future. What they have in mind, I'm sort of getting into the weeds here, but it's basically the idea that if my enemy fights in a system, if my enemy fights in a fleet, in an expeditionary air force, or whatever the case may be, and if that force is connected together by something, usually the electromagnetic spectrum for command and control, for communications, to get GPS data or whatever. If I am China, and if I can cut that connective tissue that binds together that fleet, whether it's by cyber attacks or electromagnetic warfare or whatever, what have I done at that point? I've simplified the problem for myself. I have destroyed that system, and if I destroy the system, what am I left with? My adversary is basically separated into a bunch of small clots of combat power that I can then overwhelm one by one, and thus do the Maoist thing: cut the stronger adversary down to size until I'm the stronger adversary and can flip the script on him, take the offensive, and win. So this is a doctrine that has emerged in recent years. I think it's a pretty sophisticated expression of what we have known about active defense for a long time. They are simply using it. They are simply translating active defense strategy into operations and into how the PLA will do things out at sea. So yeah, but keep in mind, a lot of these things, if you look at these are mostly shore-based systems, and I think that says something about the merger of shore and sea-based weaponry into a maritime strategy. That is something we really have to grapple with, because it doesn't really matter where a unit of combat power comes from at the scene of battle. It can come from the fleet. It can come from a shore-based aircraft. It can be an anti-ship ballistic missile or whatever. If it's at the time and place of battle, that's a unit of power that we have to reckon into the overall naval and military balance. And I think that's really the genius of access denial as China has fashioned it in recent years. Oh, I mentioned, yeah, this is just an old drawing of a flight profile for I think this must have been the DF-21D, the first generation of Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles. Again, the world's first working anti-ship ballistic missile, able to reach about 900 nautical miles offshore, according to the Pentagon. And of course, the DF-26 has a range estimated as much as 2,000 nautical miles against moving ships at sea, according to the Pentagon. So it's something that we have to think about as a key part of China's contested zone, and something we need to think about how to defend against. Yeah, here you go. Here's some eye candy right here from the 2015 military parade in Beijing, in which China, for the first time, paraded the DF-26, painted a DF-26 in nice big white letters so that we could read them. And here's how the commentator at that parade described these missiles. He stated that these are weapons these are asymmetric weapons that can strike at a hostile fleet offshore. It's our assassin's mace. Kind of a neat metaphor, isn't it? I mean, an assassin is probably weaker than his stronger adversary, but you know what? If he has a niche capability, if he has a mace, he might be able to sneak up behind that adversary and strike him down, even though he's the stronger adversary on the whole. That's just something about how China sees asymmetric combat in this age, facing off against the United States and allied fleets. Here's how the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington D.C. sees it. I'll trace out the missile arcs or the range arcs for those two weapons, and just see how much geography is really overshadowed by those range arcs. The outer one being the DF-26, going all up, actually leaping over the second island chain. Whereas even the DF-21D, the older generation, is going to let Chinese missile batteries based on shore range well over Japan, obviously South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth. So again, this is something we really have to reckon with. I don't do classified work, but the Pentagon certainly seems to take these systems very, very seriously, and therefore so do I. As you all start becoming experts on tactics and technology, you might have a better sense of how exactly how capable these things are. But as far as I can tell, everybody's worried about it. And again, just as I said, there's a whole other family of systems, all armed with anti-ship missiles that are designed to reach out and do us harm within this contested zone. This leads me to conclude that the great Wayne Hughes, who was the dean of fleet tactics here in the United States, I still drag around my copy of his book from when I was a midshipman, your age, but he concludes that one of the cornerstones of naval tactics is that a ship is a fool to fight a fort. What he's talking about is a ship being basically smaller than a land base, having fewer resources, smaller arsenals of weapons, and so forth. Generally speaking, the defender based on land, especially if he has a fleet and an air force able to reach out to sea, that's going to provide a distinct advantage even over a very capable adversary. So again, that's part of China's contested zone as well. That logic that the fleet is going to be at a disadvantage relative to a well-armed short continental power that's able to target effectively, find ships out at sea and target them and so forth. So that's it. I think that's sort of the basic logic here. And it's something you see also pop up in talks about fleet engagements, fleet on fleet engagements. One thing about, and this bears, I think, on the ROK Navy as well. As China has set out to build an ocean-going PLA Navy, it has deliberately gone out and set out to field our anti-ship missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles of all types with very, very long ranges. And in fact, the United States has not kept pace as far as extending the range of our anti-ship missiles to the extent that at which there's a real danger zone. If I'm the U.S. Navy, U.S. Pacific Fleet, and I'm trying to fight against the PLA Navy surface fleet, I'm in a real danger zone for quite some time before I can actually close the range to return fire. I mean, think about that. If the PLA Navy can launch missiles at 300 nautical miles or thereabouts away, which is a realistic figure, and if my longest range weapon is about 135 miles, I think that's the range of the advanced harpoon. That's a significant thing, because even if their stuff, even if their missiles are not as good as mine, which is probably true, if they get a lot of pot shots at me within that red zone, chances are they're going to do some serious damage and possibly even prevail over me. So again, this is part of the operational problem and tactical problem before us. I will say that we are starting to get better in this. Yeah, even in just the 2 to 3 years since the book where this comes from appeared, we've actually started fielding longer range weapons of our own. Whether it's building a new long range anti-ship missile to fire from Navy carrier aircraft or Air Force bombers, or whether it's refitting our Tomahawk cruise missiles to become anti-ship missiles. There's some good stuff going on out there, but I think this logic still holds up for now until that stuff all percolates out into the fleet in the coming years. So this range problem is something that we still have to grapple with as well. The Pentagon sums it up thus. I mean, it basically just says what I did. They are trying to put out a layered capability, defensive capability, all the way out to the second island chain. This was back in 2009 that the Pentagon said this. I think they've come a long way towards making this a reality, judging from the commentaries today. So let me close out with just a little bit of geopolitical analysis, and then I'll open for questions. What is it? I've talked about a lot about the hows, about the strategy, about the operations, and a little bit about the tactics and the hardware. What's the point, though? Well, I mean, we hear a lot about Taiwan these days. We always hear about it a lot, but it seems like the situation has been more tense even lately. What is China? What is China up to? What are China's purposes to which it is yoking all of these strategies, operations, tactics, and forces? I think a big part of it is trying to isolate Taiwan. If I want to wage a limited war against an adversary, well, it's actually not unlimited. I mean, it would be it would be an unlimited war towards China or towards Taiwan rather, because I would be trying to go ashore in Taiwan, overthrow the Taiwanese government, and so forth. But this would be a limited war towards the United States and its allies, simply because we would be the interveners trying to come to the rescue of Taiwan. So if I want to isolate Taiwan, what do I do? Well, I can try to dishearten the United States, try to dishearten President Biden or whoever is sitting in the Oval Office. If I can threaten to unleash all of these anti-access and area denial measures and do serious harm to the U.S. Military in the Western Pacific, well, I mean, what impact psychologically does that have on President Biden? He might not pay the cost. I mean, it's if you think about it, how much you want something, how much you want your goals in warfare determines how much you are willing to pay for them. So how many forces am I willing to expend in wartime? How many am I willing to lose, and for how long? If Beijing could actually skew President Biden's skew Washington's cost-benefit calculus against intervening in the Taiwan Strait, China can win without fighting, or at least without fighting the United States and its allies. If the United States accept those costs, then China will unleash the area denial component of its active defense strategy, meaning targeting forces already in the theater, whether it's the 7th Fleet sitting at Yokosuka, the amphibious contingent sitting at Sasebo, 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force on Okinawa, or of course U.S. forces based on the Korean Peninsula as well. So they will try to keep us from moving to the combat zone from within the theater. At the same time, they do the access denial thing, which again is aimed at keeping forces coming from the United States, from Hawaii or the West Coast, from unifying with forces in the theater in order to mount superior combat power and turn back Chinese aggression. If I were doing things, if I were making a strategy and executing strategy in China, this is what I would do, and I think this is exactly what they are doing, and it makes perfect strategic sense how they're doing it. So just to neck this down and wrap up, they want to unify with Taiwan, preferably without war. No nation wants to go to war, and that seems to be something particularly ingrained in China. They want to prevent Taiwan from crossing red lines that would compel them to go to war. They want to dishearten Taiwan, and especially the Taiwanese people, into accepting mainland rule so that China gets its way without fighting. But again, ultimately, it may be necessary to mount a military engagement vis-a-vis Taiwan, defeat the island's defenders, and ultimately take over. And well, by the way, this would shatter the first island chain. This would shatter that. This would shatter all that geographic barrier that I spent so much time talking about earlier on. This would also be something that would grant the PLA guaranteed access to the Western Pacific, turn the southern flank of our allies like Japan and South Korea, and thus confer a lot of geopolitical blessings upon China and upon the PLA. So I think this is a really big deal for China, as it increasingly overshadows that island. What shall we do? Well, I mean, there's a few things. All of these are easy to say. They are all also hard to do. But I think they provide sort of a signpost as we frame strategy and go out and try to execute strategy. I think we have admitted that we have a problem. As I suggested all the way back at the outset, I think it took us a long time to admit that we had a problem, to really take the Chinese military and naval buildup seriously. But I do think we're behind the curve. We're behind where we should be getting ready for that, simply because of that lag. We need to figure out how to counter access and area denial. Again, this is what weapons engineers and tacticians are talking about all the time. We need to do the Mahanian thing, ensure our own access to the common while denying China access to the common. We need to build our own alliances and reinforce our alliances, not only with South Korea and Japan, but also through informal alliances such as the Quad. We need to add to our roster as much as we can while breaking up any alliances that China has, particularly the axis between China and Russia. I would love to see us figure out a way to sort of loosen up that arrangement, so that China cannot count on Russian support in times of war. And lastly, it's always helpful to rethink your assumptions. So certain assumptions have underwritten U.S. strategy in Asia since 1945. I think the answers to these questions are probably the same as they always have been. Yes, Taiwan matters a lot, but other assumptions, there are other questions I'm not sure are so easy to answer. We're used to the United States and its allies are used to commanding the Western Pacific. Could we accept some sort of partial command? What exactly would that mean? I'm not sure the answer is yes to that one, but I think it behooves us to ask the question at least, so that it keeps us sharp and keeps us thinking about the situation as it changes around us. And lastly, is U.S. policy in Asia negotiable? For me, to ask me, the answer is no. I certainly don't think so. But you know what? There are very influential people in universities, even in war colleges such as my own, in think tanks and places like that, who increasingly are saying, look, Taiwan's not worth it. Senkaku Islands is not worth it. The islands in the South China Sea and the contested waters of the South China Sea are not worth it. Why on earth would we risk a war with a nuclear armed antagonist over these things that don't really seem to matter much? So that's something to be aware of as you look at debates here in the United States. Is simply that there are a lot of contending voices, and some of them are increasingly ready to cut loose some of these commitments. I'm not one of them, but there are a number of them out there, and they do seem to have a clout in Washington. So this is something to think about as you interact with Americans and with our other allies. Is just that these debates are going on, and I'm not entirely sure how they're going to. I feel pretty good about the situation, but the argument's really never going to be over, and so we shall see how it turns out. And lastly, I will show you a picture of the beautiful place that I go to work every day, look out over the Narragansett Bay, and of course the Chinese battle line. And with that, thank you very much for your kind attention. It's great to see everybody, and I look forward to talking about this stuff with you all.